Dr. John Hyland is Professor of History at Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia. In addition to numerous articles on Persian and Greek historical topics, he has authored the 2018 monograph Persian Interventions, the Achaemenid Empire, Athens and Sparta, 450 to 386 BCE, with Johns Hopkins University Press. He is currently writing a second book under contract with Oxford University Press that re-examines Persia's invasions of Greece in the broader context of Achaemenid and ancient Near Eastern practice. So Dr. Hyland will speak today on celebrating Achaemenid victories, a Glyptic triumphal motif, and its Greek and Egyptian victims. And with that, I'd ask everyone to join me in welcoming John Hyland.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Thank you so much to Rahim and Marissa, and to everyone at the Port Avoud Center and the Getty for sponsoring this wonderful conference and exhibit. I'm truly honored to be able to participate in the conversation today. The iconography of ancient Persian warfare as a small but vibrant subset of the Achaemenid Glyptic corpus has received a great deal of recent study. In articles by Wu Xin, as well as Christopher Tuplin's essential 2020 catalog and commentary on images of combat in Glyptic art. Although battle is absent from the Persian Empire's monumental art, the seals of Persian officials show that armed conflict continued to fire the elite imagination. The imagery varies widely, but one striking composition group appears across a notable cluster of seals. Its depiction of a Persian king or hero slaying a defeated opponent while binding others evokes aspects of the Bisotun relief, but is more explicit about the violent suppression of the enemy. Most unusually, it applies a similar visual formula to the defeat of two different enemies, signified by their apparel on two extant seals as Egyptians, but on another group of seal impressions as Greeks. Many previous studies have discussed the Greek and Egyptian victory scenes, but usually in isolation from one another, and none have yet fully explained the implications of their common features for their composition context. In this paper, I will explore this iconographic interplay and consider their significance for the representations of military triumph in the early Achaemenid Empire. To contextualize the glyptic imagery of Persian royal victory, it is useful to consider the unique dynamics of military campaigns in the reigns of Darius, Xerxes, and Artaxerxes I. Achaemenid kings, while ready to boast of divinely endowed prowess in battle, did not lead frontier campaigns with the same frequency as their Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian predecessors. This was not because they were less interested in the glory and profits of imperial warfare, but because of the scale of Persia's initial success. The 6th century conquests had eliminated all peer competitors to the empire, reducing the dynamic of interstate rivalry in contested borderlands that had driven the repetitive annual campaigning of earlier Mesopotamian kings. And they acquired a territorial expanse of such size that regular royal journeys to the frontiers were no longer practical strategies for the maintenance of power. Darius, thus, campaigned in the succession conflict of his first regnal year, but only 4 times in the subsequent decade, and after this, he turned over military commands to his sons-in-law and other trusted subordinates for the remaining 2/3 of his reign. Xerxes seems to have followed a similar pattern, leading only 2 attested campaigns, possibly 3 if we include the Babylonian revolt and its suppression, in a 21-year reign, although details are admittedly lacking for his activities after 479. Artaxerxes I was again reticent to take the field, refraining from personal leadership of the expedition to Egypt, in contrast with the previous 3 Persian monarchs. As a direct corollary to this transformation of royal military obligations from Near Eastern tradition, Achaemenid kings chose not to commission historiographical texts after Darius's Bisotun inscription. there would be no royal annals in the Assyrian style, not only because of an ideological shift that stressed generalizing power claims over specific achievement, but also because there was no longer a point to detailed chronological recording in the absence of regular royal warfare. This also bore implications for imperial art. Assyrian annals had been paired with monumental artistic compositions that illustrated or complemented their various military contents. By contrast, Bisotun employed a brief textual formula for the achievement of victories through divine aid, refusing to differentiate Darius's and his generals' battles from one another through the inclusion of narrative detail. And its relief, depicting the restoration of order as Darius faced down a line of captive enemies, made no effort to illustrate the implicit fighting that had put the liar kings in Darius's power. Achaemenid palace art employed symbolic representations of the king's protection of order through combat with monsters, or depicted files of soldiers as representatives of royal authority and its reach, but they did not depict battle against human enemies. But this did not prevent Persian rulers from choosing other methods to celebrate the rare, spectacular occasions on which they did march forth to the frontiers. Darius erected stelae to mark the canal building that followed his Egyptian campaign and his crossings of the Bosporus and the Danube. The question is whether such specific commemoration could extend from the monumental to the miniature, through the commissioning of seals that reminded their fortunate users of the king's accomplishments. Potential candidates are rare. 80% of the battle scenes collected in Tuplin's catalog feature Persian warriors without a crown that indicates explicit royal identity. And the seal corpus, as Tuplin recognizes, does not promote an exclusive association between kingship and military victory. Most studies have therefore interpreted glyptic scenes of royal violence as advertisements of an ideological mission to impose order in place of chaos, rather than as depictions of specific military events. But, on the other hand, the scarcity of the royal campaigns would have endowed the rare explicit images of royal victory with a special importance that must have stood out upon use in comparison with more common glyptic imagery. If a particular king led just one campaign against a specific enemy, we could expect an image of a king or hero defeating that same enemy to evoke the memory of that same expedition for at least the remainder of that reign. With this in mind, let us look more closely at the linked scenes of victory over Greeks and Egyptians. And this is the seal which you got a glimpse of before, with a hand copy by Mark Garrison. The seal known as PTS 28 from the Persepolis treasury, depicting royal victory over Greeks, does not survive in the original. But excavators discovered several imprints on fired clay administrative labels in room 33 of the treasury at Persepolis. Erich Schmidt published the first images in his 1957 Persepolis volume. A separate impression became part of the National Museum of Iran's collection, it's NMI 6580, and Akbar Tajvidi found numerous impressions of a similar image, which he published in 1976. Yet another related impression, and here's just another image, some ceilings that are in Chicago. Another related impression appears on a rounded label that the collector, Eshak Shakai, acquired in Iran sometime before 1985 and sold to the Boston MFA in 1989. The Schmidt and National Museum of Iran images are derived from one or more cylinder seals, but the Tajvidi and Boston scenes appear on rounded clay bullae, which Christopher Tuplin has associated with stamp seal usage. Overall, he concludes that, quote, we have evidence for at least 2, possibly 3, and still conceivably more than 3 distinct stones bearing an almost identical image, end quote. Mark Garrison, on the contrary, has argued recently that all the surviving sealings may be the product of one single cylinder seal, which is put to prolific use within the treasury environs. Many of the impressions are incomplete, but in combination, they permit reconstruction of the whole. The central figure is the king. The impressions of PTS 28 obscure the top of his head, but the equivalent figure on the Boston MFA bulla wears a four-pointed crown. Again, that's on the right. He is dressed in a court robe with a wide dangling sleeve and a bow and quiver slung behind his back. With his left hand, the king seizes his kneeling enemy's right arm, while with his right he drives a spear into the vanquished opponent's neck. The defeated figure is marked as Greek by his crested Corinthian helmet and a large round aspis shield, obscured on the Chicago ceilings, where an overlapping stamp seal obscures the best preserved version, but more clearly visible on the Boston MFA bulla. He turns his head away from the king and does not attempt to ward off the fatal blow. 3 additional helmeted Greeks line up in a row behind their conqueror, hands tied behind their backs. They hunch forward slightly, torsos overlapping, and are shorter than the king, who has them secured by a rope tied to his belt and looped around the prisoners' necks. The Chalcedony cylinder seals, with scenes of Persian victory over Egypt, survive intact, although, unlike most of the impressions of PTS 28, they do not stem from documented excavations. Both first surfaced in private art collections of the late 19th and early 20th centuries before purchased by major museum collections. Hermitage, 19499, supposedly found in Kerch in eastern Crimea, belonged to the Zvenigorodsky family in the 1880s before passing into the possession of the Hermitage. Metropolitan Museum, 1999, 325, 114, does not have an attested provenance before its ownership by Dikran Kalekian, a late 19th century Armenian art dealer whose granddaughter donated it to the Met in New York in 1999 as part of a larger Near Eastern seal collection. This seal is damaged, as you can see, with the bottom broken away at the knees of the royal figure, but the majority of the image remains and resembles its Hermitage counterpart with only minor differences. The Egyptian victory scenes also center a Persian hero in court robes in the same strident posture with bow and quiver over the back shoulder. But earlier commentators, including Margaret Cool-Root and Wolfgang Balzer and others, have pointed out a notable difference in the high fluted hat that takes the place of a dentate Achaemenid crown. The flutes taper to narrow points in the Metropolitan Museum seal and are rounded in the Zvenigorodsky one. Because such headdresses are more common on non-royal figures in Achaemenid monumental art, such as the Persepolis guard in the relief we saw in the Getty Museum exhibition. Most previous studies have concluded that the crownless protagonist is not a king, despite the surrounding connotations of royal authority. On the other hand, at least one royal name seal from the provincial center of Deuskalion, DS4 from the reign of Artaxerxes I, does show the king in a clear audience scene in a similar fluted tiara. So it may be premature to downgrade the hero's royal status. His action, in any case, matches that of the king in the Greek victory seal, as he seizes and spears a kneeling enemy while leading a file of bound and overlapping captives by a rope. There is one additional prisoner in the file, and a palm tree stands to the side. The appearance of the enemy is Egyptianized, above all, through the defeated leader's pharaonic crown. The shared focus of the Greek and Egyptian victory images is a Persian commander's execution of justice on opponents whom he has already deprived of their capacity for future violence. In contrast with a number of Achaemenid combat seals, the fighting is over. No signs of battle, such as fallen bodies, remain on the field. The defeated enemy no longer carry weapons, although the Greeks' helmets and shield are indicative of their prior intentions. The target of execution, forced to one knee, makes no further effort to counterattack, and the bound prisoners stand by as passive observers of his fate. Royal victory is comprehensive, with the binding of captives an absence of other combatants signifying the return of peace and freedom from the threat of chaos envisioned in some of the inscriptions of Darius and Xerxes. The composition uses the enemy's garments and headdress to mark their foreignness to a Persian audience, an association with specific, prominent populations of the empire's outer reaches, thereby visualizing the distance that the Persian king has traveled in order to restore the world's security. As Wouter Henkelmann noted in a 1995 study of royal crown imagery, these seals echo Naqsh Rostam by compelling their viewers to recognize just how far Persia's spear has gone forth from Persia. Apart from the distinction between the protagonist's headdress in the Greek and Egyptian victory scenes, there are other differences in detail, including the posture of the prisoners, more upright Egyptians in the Zvenigorodsky seal versus Greeks leaning forward in PTS 28, and the pose and dress of the condemned opponent. While the dying Greek's torso faces the king, he turns his head to avert his gaze from the final blow. But the Egyptian's pose is reversed, turning away from his conqueror, perhaps in attempted flight, but looking back towards the Persian hero and the prisoners assembled to watch his death. The pharaoh's crown conveys a further political resonance, serving not only as a marker of ethnic identity, in the style of the Greek helmets or the pointed hat of Bisotun's Saka chieftain. It elevates its wearer's status above the other Egyptians and indicates a claim to authority within the tradition of local kingship. It might allude to Persia's overthrow of indigenous Egyptian order, but perhaps more likely depicts the wearer as a liar, posing as king of Egypt, but lacking the divine favor that entrusted its rightful rule to Achaemenid hands. Yet these variations do not lessen the striking compositional unity in the overall depiction of Persian victory. As prior commentators have recognized, the Glyptic victory scenes have a compositional ancestor in the Bisotun relief, and its longer lineup of prisoners awaiting royal judgment. There are clear differences in staging, as the Bisotun liar kings stand before Darius instead of behind him. Bisotun's queue is longer and more diverse, reflecting the unique chaos of Darius's succession conflict against rivals and rebels from numerous regions. But the stela erected in Babylon, with a smaller variant of the Bisotun relief, depicted only Babylonian prisoners, and this or a comparable monument may have served as an intermediary point of reference. The primary change is the seal's inclusion of slaughter, whereas Bisotun avoids overt violence in the relief except for Darius' stance atop the body of Gaumata. But Bisotun's written texts do stress the smiting of enemies and bloody fate of captive ringleaders, and the Akkadian and Aramaic versions measure the relative scale of each victory by quantifying enemy troops killed and captured, as well as the notables put to death. This is just what PTS 28 and the Egyptian seals visualize in revising the Bisotun iconography, skipping the actual battles, but highlighting the conclusive killing and seizing of enemies as the essential combined elements of victory. With this in mind, it is possible to consider a chronological context that best explains the victory seal's related composition. The discovery of the PTS 28 images on objects from the Persepolis treasury provide an initial clue. Although none have appeared on dated documents, some of the impressions appear on uninscribed bullae alongside other seal images that also occur on tablets dated to Xerxes. This potential date for the Greek victory scene is further supported by stylistic features. PTS 28 belongs to the category of Achaemenid seal carving known as the court style, associated with workshops in the vicinity of Persepolis. The majority of court-style seals date to the late 6th or early 5th century, but Mark Garrison has called attention to PTS 28's overlapping figures, which are almost non-existent in seals from the Fortification Archive, as an artistic development that dates to the end of Darius's reign and that of Xerxes. As for the Egyptian victory seals, despite their possible frontier find spots, they also exhibit details of court-style iconography, such as the palm tree, which also appears in many of the royal name seals. Their expansion on the motif of the overlapping figures should also put them at a relatively later date. The extent of their compositional resemblance to PTS 28 points towards a close chronological linkage. Based on the resemblances to Bisotun, a recent study by Henry Colburn proposed that the Egyptian victory seals may have been produced to celebrate Darius's initial reconquest of Egypt from the rebel pharaoh Pedubastis IV. But in light of their later stylistic features and iconographic links with PTS 28, it seems preferable to take them as a refinement of the Bisotun scene carried out in a subsequent generation, comparable with the textual evolution between the contents of Bisotun Column 5 and Xerxes' Daiwa inscription. Xerxes' reign thus provides a tempting historical context for both victory scenes, as his personal campaigns against Egypt and Greece occurred in very close proximity. He probably returned from the first in 484 and began preparations for the second in 483. If the figure in the Egyptian victory seal is meant to be the king after all, this could point to the issue of a joint commemorative program depicting both campaigns as heroic royal triumphs. But, alternatively, if the fluted headdress truly is meant to distinguish a Persian hero from the actual king, other possibilities must be considered. In that case, we might remember that the Egyptian revolt confronted by Xerxes predated the start of his reign, and the Egyptian victory seal might have been carved during the preparations for its suppression in Darius's final years, predicting reconquest without an expectation of direct royal command, but alluding to the triumphs over liar kings that marked Darius's initial rise to power. After Xerxes took power and completed the Egyptian campaign, designers of the Greek victory scene may have revised the imagery, again in connection with Xerxes' second campaign, visually linking the king with his father's military iconography, but amplifying the scene's royal imagery with a crown in light of the new ruler's return to personal leadership. A final alternative could be that the Egyptian scene is the later of the two, adapting Xerxes' victory imagery in the reign of Artaxerxes and the context of Inaros's revolt, while subtly downplaying the necessity of a direct royal presence for the achievement of victory. So obviously confident identifications of any of these three scenarios are beyond us in light of the current evidence. I would like to close with some thoughts on the implications of these similar scenes and their victory imagery with or without a king. The iconographic similarities here are too close for coincidence. Other seals display a number of related images and concepts, but none that so strongly resemble each other's staging as this pair. Their reproduction on multiple seals and connection with the premier monumental image of royal triumph in the prior reign suggest not just elite emulations of royal messaging, but a centralized design disseminated in the name of the king. Earlier studies have already established the likely derivation of court-style images from royal or court commissions in the seal carving workshops of Persepolis. In the case of these related victory scenes, we might envision the court's interaction with a few favored workshops or artists over a short chronological duration. In the case of the Egyptian scenes, an original scene produced at court may have followed its owner to a provincial location before deposit there or reproduction by local masters. In any case, the commission of closely related scenes on multiple seals offers evidence for a royal intention to commemorate imperial campaigns, even if they were not to be described in written narratives on clay or stone. They not only highlighted the ideological impulse to suppress enemies in the borderlands and the rule that those who dared to oppose Achaemenid order would suffer the consequences. Rather, they also call to mind specific images, specific occasions on which a king or his proxy marched out to the frontiers to overcome Egyptian and Greek opponents. Bestowed on favored court officials or provincial elites, they connected their owners with an ongoing image of imperial victory. And through repeated usage, they reiterated an official message of invincibility, unbroken by the realities of localized frontier defeats in 480 and 479. Thank you.